already done yesterday. So I invite Professor Alexandra to begin the presentation.
Thank you so much, and thanks again for inviting me to this nice collections of talks and lively discussions. So yesterday we finished discussing the polarity-based semantics for non-distributive logics, or lattice-based logics, as perhaps would be, a more appropriate name for it. And we finished essentially discussing three desiderata for, let's say, what a good semantics and a semantics that gives ulterior meaning to these logics should satisfy. And the desiderata were essentially explaining the failure of the distributivity law in a way that shows that this failure is not a problem, but is actually a desirable feature. And an interpretation which extends coherently to the meaning of the modal operators involved. And for the sake of this talk, the running interpretation is the epistemic interpretation. And the third and last basic desideratum was the requirement that this interpretation carries over to explaining the meaning of certain modal axioms. And we discussed the axiom that in classical epistemic logic captures factivity of knowledge, and we discussed also positive introspection, and essentially, well, you might or might not agree, of course, with this view, but the idea that I proposed to you was that the spirit, let's say the factivity spirit, survives the shift from the classical to the lattice-based setting, and in particular to a view of logic as a propositional logic, where formulas are interpreted as propositions, to a setting which is the polarity-based setting, in which formulas are not anymore interpreted as propositions, so they are not interpreted as being true or false at states in a frame, but they are interpreted as being names for formal concepts. So concepts, theories such as, for instance, musical genres or movie genres, or cats and dogs and apples and oranges. So we round up this discussion with the analysis of the first order correspondence on polarities of the axiom of factivity, namely that knowledge is grounded in facts, which, as we all know, in the classical setting corresponds to the first order condition of reflexivity, and here, I mean, corresponds to the idea that the agent's attributions are factually correct. And likewise, positive introspection also corresponds to a kind of an awareness condition, such that requiring essentially that the agent is aware of the consequences of her own attributions. Now, let's say as a bonus, in a sense, and this is what I would like to finish this part before going into the next part, the one which concerns a completely different interpretation of non-distributive logics, or LE logics. So I was saying a bonus in a sense is that this epistemic setting and this epistemic interpretation can be put to use to generalize the, I mean, both formal concept analysis, the theory of formal concept analysis as an information theory, and the concept, the theory of rough set theory in a unified environment, which I call the unified environment of rough concepts, in which you can describe and talk about concepts being approximated from above and from below, in let's say just in a very similar way in which you approximate concepts or let's say predicates in approximation spaces within rough set theory. So in this particular environment, let's say the frames, I mean let's say the polarity-based frames that serve as approximation spaces, I mean, can be called conceptual approximation spaces, and consist essentially of a polarity P, so two domains, one domain of objects, one domain of features, and a relation connecting objects and features, and two relations, I mean, standing for interpreting, let's say, the lower approximation, the R box, and the upper approximation, R diamond. And these two relations have the type that we described yesterday, namely, the box relation goes from objects to features, whereas the diamond relation goes from features to objects. And this condition, which is a first order condition, can be understood as a basic condition which guarantees that the lower approximation, so the box of a category, is always a subcategory of the upper approximation of the same category. So this environment, I mean, not only generalizes, let's say, the whole enterprise of rough set theory to an environment which is based on formal concept analysis and formal contexts, but allows for an analysis, like a modular analysis of the various conditions that let's say can be required or is let's say sensible to be required in this particular setting. And moreover, the analysis that we have done, and the fact that I mean, the theory essentially allows to let's say the modal theory of these structures allows essentially to connect first order conditions on approximation spaces to first order conditions on conceptual approximation spaces. How? Because essentially you take the modal axiom, for instance, defining reflexivity on cryptic frames, so on generalized approximation spaces, and you look for the first order correspondent of the same axiom on polarities, and there are essentially two flavors of this one, let's say, box related flavor, and another diamond related flavor that essentially is in this particular case captured through the converse relation, which captures the right adjoint of this diamond. So we can essentially define notions of, I mean, first known first order conditions on frames. We can lift them to the context of polarities. thanks to first order correspondence and the fact that this what I call reflexivity conditions here, the first order conditions on polarities, actually are the first order correspondence of the same axiom defining or corresponding to reflexivity on Kripke frames. So this is quite an interesting phenomenon, because I mean, not only do they do these let's say first order languages talk to each other via their common modal, let's say parenthood under inverted commas, but also, I mean, there is an independent way of defining the connection between them via, in fact, a functor which embeds the Kripke frames into polarities. And I am going, I mean, this is also relevant for what comes next. But the thing is that, I mean, independently, I mean, just looking at this particular interpretation, we have now, let's say, opening up, I mean, a whole host of different questions that we can ask about how to generalize systematically the theory of, well, rough set theory in a way that incorporates and unifies in a coherent way formal concept analysis and rough set theory simultaneously. So this is just a small, let's say, sneak preview. If you are interested in this, I mean, tomorrow I can both expand more on this connection, and I can also speak a little bit more about the practical, or let's say the extra mathematical ramification and potential applications to decision theory, management science, but also artificial intelligence, categorization in machine learning, and so on and so forth. So this is just the way I wanted to round up what I was discussing yesterday, and again, taking stock of this part of the story. Well, my claim, which is of course debatable, and if you disagree, I mean, please, I mean, don't hesitate to express your disagreement, and I mean, so that I can learn from it. But let's say the thesis that I would like to defend and propose to you during this talk is that the semantics, the polarity-based semantics is such that the three basic desiderata of a semantic environment for, let's say, delivering more than just formal interpretation or mathematically founded interpretation, but also some kind of insight as to the meaning of the logic of the language, what this language means, have been met by the polarity-based semantics. And then, I mean, as a bonus, there's the possibility to establish a systematic connection between these ideas, the polarity-based semantics, and the theory of, well, rough set theory in as a unified, like as a more general theory which unifies rough set theory and formal concept analysis. Okay, so this is what I wanted to say about polarities. So from now on, what I'm going to do is I will expand more on what I have just hinted at in the previous in my previous talk, namely the graph-based semantics. And the first thing about this graph-based semantics, and which I already anticipated yesterday, was precisely that comparing graph-based semantics with the polarity-based semantics, we see that they stem from one and the same methodology, and this methodology is about let's say translating, dually characterizing the algebraic semantics for a given logic into a set-based semantics or polarity-based semantics or crypty-style semantics for that same logic. So both the semantics of graph-based frames and polarity-based frames stem from this methodology. However, and this is, I think, the interesting part of this story, or at least, I mean, like when we started understanding things in this way, it was a very surprising thing that took us also a while, in a sense, to actually digest conceptually. So the thing is that reflexive graphs can be understood as generalized crypty frames, and many, let's say, mechanisms that we see in the crypty frame semantics for classical logic, modal logic, intuitionistic logic, actually, I mean, are generalized in a very coherent way. So I want to start, in a sense, to give you this kind of intuition by, let's say, setting reflexive graphs as, let's say, the end of a kind of telescopic process of progressive generalization that starts with sets. So here, for instance, you see a set with 3 elements, which can be represented as a polarity just by taking 2 copies of the set and linking essentially each point to the points that do not correspond to itself. So, for instance, the state U is related because it is different from W and V, but it's not related with U because these 2 points are essentially copies of the same point, and so on and so forth. And when you essentially lift, like connect the 2 copies via essentially the generalization of the complement of the identity relation on the set, and compute, let's say, the lattice, the concept lattice in the usual way, namely using essentially the Galois connection induced by the incidence relation on polarity. So what you are doing is essentially, let's say, using the same kind of recipe that you would use for any polarities. What you get is a Boolean algebra. So, I mean, you generate essentially the complex algebra of the frame in the classical case using the general recipe of polarities in this particular way. Next, essentially going, let's say, from the classical to the intuitionistic or distributive setting, what you do is essentially moving from sets to partially ordered sets or preorders, and you again essentially lift or embed such a preorder or such a poset into a corresponding polarity, just again by taking two copies of the set and lifting the relation in, I mean, using essentially the complement of the relation. So essentially connecting any state to the states that that are actually not greater than or equal than itself. And again, applying the usual Galois connection and generation of concept lattice, what you get is a hiding algebra or a distributive lattice. In this particular case, of course, we are talking about I mean, finite sets. So all these lattices are complete, and therefore, I mean, in fact, have many other properties. So, for instance, they are perfect, and so on and so forth. Now, I mean, like, so this, let's say, the way I discussed yesterday, that a reflexive graph is associated with its lattice. So you can think of it as the complex algebra of this reflexive graph, in analogy with modal logic, for instance. Reproduces precisely these steps. Namely, what you do is you take two copies of the domain of the graph, and you connect, I mean, each state in one copy to the states of the other copy that the given state does not access with the reflexive relation defined on the graph. And again, complex lattice, this is what you get. And as you see, I mean, there is a progressive generalization, I mean, from Boolean to intuitionistic or distributive to general lattices, which corresponds to let's say, properties of the relation that is that has been actually lifted. Because here, when we talk about sets, we, in a sense, conceal the relation, but the relation is there, and it is the identity relation, which is reflexive, symmetric, and transitive. Here, when we go from sets to preorders, we are essentially retaining the reflexivity and the transitivity, and throwing away the symmetry. And lastly, when we retain, I mean, in reflexive graphs, what we do is retaining reflexivity and relaxing and not requiring any more transitivity. And in fact, I mean, what we have an actually very interesting result, which essentially says that let's say, if a reflexive graph happens to be also transitive, then I mean, you can prove, in fact, I mean, a kind of if and only if characterization that says that that this happens if and only if the corresponding concept lattice is actually distributive. So in one direction, you need actually to assume also anti-symmetry, but it's almost a perfect if and only if, which let's say tightly connects the property of transitivity with the distributivity of the associated complex algebra. So so when you see let's say reflexive graphs as let's say a next step in a progression that we kind of know very well, because we have studied a lot, let's say, how to generalize the classical case, in the classical setting, in a non-classical way, starting with intuitionistic logic. I mean, we have developed many insights that, in fact, I mean, now we can transfer and profit from and use to better understand, let's say, these semantics and how, in fact, I mean, these semantics supports an interpretation of non-distributive logics as hyper-constructive logic. So let's start again with the basic fragment, so the propositional fragment, which corresponds to let's say the negation-free fragment of classical propositional logic, endowed essentially with the axioms that correspond to the validities in the variety of general lattices. So as we were discussing yesterday, the idea is transferring algebraic semantics into an interpretation of formulas on frames. And again, the technique is always the same. We, for instance, take evaluation and interpretation of atomic propositions on lattices. I mean, on a lattice which is the concept lattice of coming, let's say, originating from a graph. And again, this concept lattice will have an extension and an intention. And this extension and intention, respectively, will define two forcing relations, this time essentially on the same state, of course. So we will talk about a state somehow, again, v-dashing, whatever for the moment this means, and another forcing relation which we call swoosh. And I mean, just because this is the symbol in LaTeX, but essentially we have the dichotomy between one forcing relation and the other. And I mean, like in the context of polarities, remember that the first forcing relation was essentially on objects and talked about membership of objects into categories, and the same and analogously the second relation was interpreted on the set of features of a polarity, and was interpreted intuitively as a description, like, I mean, like the feature being part of the intention of the formal concept, and therefore being part of its description. Now here, the interpretation that we propose is much closer to what you would expect. So formulas are still propositions. Formulas can be either true or false, and the first forcing relation is the positive one, the one saying the proposition is satisfied at that state. And the second forcing relation is understood as a refutation relation. So the given proposition is false, is refuted at the given state. And so let's say in this framework, reflexivity plays a very important role, because it makes sure, it guarantees that no proposition is both satisfied and refuted at the same state. I mean, of course, dropping reflexivity would give us or allow the possibility to access, I mean, a paraconsistent environment, a paraconsistent logical environment, which would be interesting in its own right. But for the sake of this talk, we will stick with a logic which is non-paraconsistent, as is the classical logic or the intuitionistic logic. Now, I mean, like, let's look at the first, I mean, characteristic feature that we do not see in classical logic nor in intuitionistic logic, namely that, I mean, given the fact that these two sets, let's say the satisfaction set, the truth set, and the refutation set are disjoint, do they form a partition? So do they cover the whole domain of the graph? Well, the answer is not necessarily. So we do not have, let's say, a situation in which not being satisfied is the same as being refuted. And likewise, I mean, it is not true that because a formula is not refuted, then it is accepted, okay? So you can have, like in this particular situation, look, for instance, at the valuation of, or the interpretation of the atomic variable Q. Here you see that the extension of Q under the interpretation V is the state U, and the refutation set of Q is the state W. So you see here in the picture. So in the picture, essentially, formulas which are put above, which lie above the state, are let's say satisfied at the state, and formulas that are written below the state are refuted. So you can think of up and down. So here you see that essentially Q, I mean, is true at U and false at W, but at the state V, Q is neither true nor false. So we can say that, I mean, of course, we do not have a negation. So I mean, like in this basic environment of basic lattice logic, because remember, we have just top, bottom, and join and meet as our connective. So we do not have, let's say, not even the possibility to express the principle of excluded middle like we do, for instance, in intuitionistic logic, right, at the object level. However, I mean, of course, thanks to the satisfaction and refutation, there is a way of looking at whether the excluded middle holds at the metalinguistic level. That is, whether it is the case that a formula is either satisfied or refuted at any given state. And this is, for instance, the case in intuitionistic logic. In intuitionistic logic, the truth set and the refutation set of formulas form a partition, right? So if a formula is not satisfied, I'm talking about, of course, at the metalinguistic level, where we talk about satisfaction and refutation, not whether the negation of P is true or not at a certain state, right? So the idea is that, for instance, in intuitionistic logic, the principle of excluded middle, as everybody knows, fails, but it doesn't fail at the metalinguistic level, whereas here we see this failure at a deeper level, namely at the metalinguistic level. Another, let's say, interesting comparison between this setting and the graph-based setting and the intuitionistic Kripke frames is the phenomenon of persistence, right? So in intuitionistic logic, the valuation of propositions is persistent in the sense that if a formula is true at one state, then it keeps on being true at every at every successor of that state. Here, what we observe is a phenomenon of weak persistence. So it's not really the case that that it goes like this, but what we see is that if a proposition or a formula is true at a given state, then, I mean, at the successors of that state, the formula cannot be refuted. Okay, so for instance, I mean, like, look at this example. So this example is again an example of a reflexive but not transitive frame. Otherwise, this complex algebra would be distributive, whereas it is properly non-distributive, in the sense that distributivity here in this lattice famously fails. And then you see essentially that at U, Q is true. Then at the direct successor of V, you have, I mean, no opinion on Q. And then, I mean, now that we have, let's say, no opinion, we can make a further step and refute Q at the third stage, right? So this is an example of weak persistence at work. Okay. So again, the same kind of steps. So the three steps that we wanted to that we required essentially and discussed in the framework of polarity-based frames hold also here. Namely, I mean, the semantics is compositional, and therefore the interpretation, I mean, once we have an interpretation for atomic propositions, this interpretation compositionally extends to compound formulas. And so that essentially, using the trick of the dual characterization, we can indeed discuss, let's say, and define an interpretation. So in this particular case, for instance, a support relation or a satisfaction relation of disjunction formulas. So here, another phenomenon that we have seen and we know very well in intuitionistic logic is that certain connectives, like for instance intuitionistic implication, need to change their interpretation, and the reason being essentially that let's say the algebra, the complex algebra, I mean, of the non-classical frames is not closed under the usual interpretation, like the classical interpretation of a given connective, right? So in particular, because the frames, intuitionistic frames, are essentially let's say dualized as the power set of the upsets, the set of upsets of the frame associated with the pre-order of the frame. This algebra is not closed to set theoretic complement, as it is very well known. Namely, the complement of an upset is actually a downset, and therefore it doesn't belong to the algebra. And therefore, this makes it necessary to change the interpretation of implicative formulas in intuitionistic frame in such a way that the new interpretation is an operation of the algebra, and in fact turns out to be the hiding implication of the complex algebra. Likewise, I mean, the join, which is typically interpreted both in the classical setting and in the intuitionistic setting as set theoretic union, is not anymore supported by these algebras, by concept lattices, because as we have discussed when showing essentially that that distributivity fails, when we define the join, we are taking the intentional perspective, and we are saying essentially that the join of two categories, so the least common supercategory is the category defined intentionally by the intersection of the intentions, right? And this allows many more objects to belong in the category than those that belong simply to the union of the extensions of the two joinants. So in this particular case, again, spelling out the machinery of the dual characterization, we obtain an interpretation of join formulas, which is intentional, therefore uses the E relation, so the accessibility relation of the frame, exactly in the same way the interpretation of intuitionistic implication formulas is an intentional connective, is intentional in the sense that in order to establish whether an implication holds at a certain state, you need really to see the behavior of the formulas, of the direct subformulas at all successors of that state. Likewise here, the intentional interpretation of join formulas essentially says that a disjunction holds at a point if essentially no successor refutes both disjuncts. Okay, and so I mean the idea would be, given the fact that that again this is the interpretation that we need to make sense of, this is the mathematical interpretation, and it is up to us to try and understand whether this is actually whether there are contexts, extra mathematical contexts, in which this interpretation becomes the natural one, the natural interpretation of disjunction. So are there such contexts again in which this interpretation is natural? So again, this is let's say what I'm going to argue with you that works, and I would like very much to know what do you think of this interpretation. Maybe there are other interpretations. Maybe you don't find this interpretation particularly convincing, but here it goes. So in order to describe such a setting, let me just tell you a small story, which is a Rashomon-type story. I don't know if you know the film, the movie Rashomon, but I mean this is a much simpler and in fact almost ridiculously stupid story. The movie, I mean, I can definitely recommend you because it's much more complex and very beautiful. But we were not at the stage of being able to formalize that yet. So this is what I can give you. So there is a judge who needs to establish whether a certain defendant, which who we think of as a female defendant, is to be declared not guilty of the physical injuries sustained by a friend of hers, which we think, or who we think of as a male person. So not guilty in this particular very simplified environment is captured by a disjunction of two atomic propositions, which should be intuitively understood as follows. Proposition P says that the defendant has not willingly caused harm to her friend. So if the harm was not intentional, then I mean, like, you can be not declared not guilty, and you can be declared also not guilty if you acted, or the female defendant acted, in self-defense. Now we have three witnesses that were heard by the judge. We call them A, B, C, and each of them has a different story or a different recount of what happened. So witness A reports, I saw the defendant, so the female defendant, grabbing a tennis racket and hitting her friend. She looked terrified and didn't utter a sound. Witness B says, I saw the defendant grabbing a tennis racket and hitting her friends, and she looked frightened, but not necessarily by her friend. Witness C finally says, I heard the defendant scream that there was a poisonous spider on her friend's shoulder, so she killed the spider. Okay, so this is what the judge has collected as an evidence, as evidence. He doesn't know and cannot establish, I mean, whether any witness is lying or not. I mean, the only thing that the witness, that the judge can evaluate is what do these pieces, these testimonies, I mean, support or go against, and how they relate, all these testimonies relate to each other. So how, on the basis of these elements, will the judge decide? Well, lo and behold, let's say the information can be, let's say, depicted as again, this famous reflexive but non-transitive graph that we have been discussing. And the three states of the graph are essentially the three witnesses with their testimonies. And I mean, like, their testimonies, I mean, let's say, support certain statements like P or Q or neither. So for instance, I mean, like, witness A supports the idea that the defendant acted in self-defense because she was terrified, and do not support, actually refute, the fact that the defendant, I mean, like, the harm was not intentional, because actually, I mean, according to witness A, she was terrified and was acting willingly, but in self-defense. Witness B, I mean, again, supports, well, refutes the idea that that the harm was not willingly caused, but doesn't say absolutely anything whether this was in self-defense or not. Finally, witness C, I mean, again, well, gives essentially a completely different account of the story, namely one in which, in fact, the harm caused was certainly not willingly caused, and moreover actually refutes the fact that the defendant acted in self-defense. Now, the arrows here, I mean, can be understood as how, let's say, the different testimonies are consistent with one another. So for instance, I mean, like the testimony of witness A and that of witness C, I mean, completely clash with each other. So they are not related to each other. Each of them is consistent with itself. And let's say, I mean, they are consistent in, let's say, in a progressive way, but there is always some particular in the, let's say, in the successive testimony which clashes with the first one, so that I mean, arrows are not symmetric. So in this particular case, you see that essentially there is it is never the case that I mean, a successor of a state refutes both disjuncts, and therefore P or Q holds at the three states, which essentially leads, in a sense, to a very conservative way of understanding, or let's say, the disjunction, one which essentially well, yields a non-guilty verdict. So this is essentially the conclusion for today, and also the conclusions for here. These two interpretations stem from the same kind of mathematical methodology, but they differ widely in the way these two logics, well, the same logic, can be interpreted. On the one hand, an interpretation which allows to talk about let's say, syllogistic reasoning and epistemic stances on of various agents on categories and concepts, and another one which supports, let's say, a kind of evidential reasoning, like modeling, let's say, evidential reasoning, first and foremost, precisely because let's say, support, so satisfaction and refutation now are essentially held on a par in this environment, so that you need evidence to support a statement, but you also, I mean, lack of evidence is not enough to refute a statement. What you need to have is evidence against that statement, right? So, I mean, like, the two situations are now held on a par. I stop here. I thank you very much and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, for the nice talk. So we can have some questions. If anyone wish, they can also write the question on chat as well.
Hello, I'm Prasenjit.
Hello?
Yes, Prasenjit, go ahead.
I hear you very bad. So can you repeat the question?
You have studied the property of polarity for the first order formula corresponding to reflexivity and transitivity. My question is that is there any theory that study the first order formula corresponding to the property of the polarity, like clarified polarity or separate polarity, or maybe a polarity can be a function or bijective functions, like for corresponding to this property, is there any first order formula, like is there any theory like that?
So well, there's definitely a lot on this. I mean, on the mathematical studies of properties of polarities in formal concept analysis. There is, let's say, what I've been doing is I've been working on the logical formalization, so studying polarities and their first order theory from the point of view of generalized Sahlquist correspondence theory. So there indeed there's I mean, like within this theory, I mean, there is essentially the syntactic identification of a class of formulas that essentially that are valid on polarity-based frames if and only if the polarity-based frame satisfy certain first-order conditions. So, so this is the general setup, which I mean, let's say mostly given a modal axiom. I mean, taking the modal axioms as a starting point goes towards the first order condition and gives the characterization in first order terms. However, we are now very recently, I mean, like there is not, let's say, nothing, I mean, out there, not even as a preprint yet, but let's say in weeks, there will be. There's also the so-called inverse correspondence, that is, given a certain first order condition, can you see or characterize whether the first order condition is modally definable? Can you say that it is definitely not modally definable, for instance? And can you algorithmically generate the modal axiom that corresponds to that certain first order condition? So we are working in this direction as well. So there will be more, hopefully, very soon.
Thank you.
So is there any other question?
You're very welcome.
Okay, so if there is no question, then let us thank the speaker once again.
I think there is a question in the chat box.
Yes. So Hendrik was saying, okay, I mean, like, so there's a lot. Yes, I mean, I can confirm there is a lot. So I would suggest, if you, I mean, Hendrik, if you are interested, I mean, let's schedule an appointment. I mean, like a one-on-one Zoom conversation. I can guide you through the literature, and I can tell you where to find what. Okay, so, and I mean, actually, a question that I would like to ask you guys is precisely concerning what to do next, because I could, for instance, try tomorrow and give a more application-oriented or a more, let's say, conceptually oriented, let's say, talk. Or I could, for instance, give a little bit more details on things that I have discussed today and yesterday. I mean, as you prefer, as you find more useful for you.
According to me, I'll be happy to have a few more discussions, what you have done today and yesterday, and also together with few more theoretical things, which you said as a
so
second.
Let's say further directions. I mean, like past and future.
Yes, so like that.
You mean like something like past and future? Okay.
Yeah, so, yeah, something like that. So
I can definitely do that.
Yeah, so I'll prefer that, but I don't know about the others. Yeah, so others should speak up.
Yeah, Shurabda, I will be interested. I am also interested to learn about the future direction.
Mhm.
Okay. No, definitely. I mean, there's really a world here opening up. So and there are very interesting, I mean, developments also which connect with both, I would say, philosophical interpretations of things, like, I mean, like making, for instance, categorization theory clearer, more transparent. I mean, like really accounting for, let's say, for instance, different ways of understanding categories. Are categories vague? Are categories dynamic? Where does the dynamism of categories come from? I mean, so there's a host, let's say, of philosophical questions, but also these philosophical questions have a very practical import, because I mean, for instance, I mean, not for nothing, I am affiliated in a management science department, and essentially what these people are interested in, I mean, they work a lot with categories and identities, and they do so in relationship with decision making. I mean, like, so consumers' decision making or political decisions. I mean, they do not happen, let's say, out of thin air. I mean, they are embedded in the understanding of categories. So, and they influence, I mean, like, decisions influence both the meaning of the underlying category and also the future decisions that will be taken. So, for instance, there's an extremely interesting and completely not explored, let's say, line of research connecting categories and self-reinforcing processes. So, I mean, like, so all these ideas, I mean, I can try essentially and make some kind of overview, so that maybe we can also organize some kind of plan and future directions, I mean, that we can pursue together.
Okay, thank you, Alexandra. So we end this session here. I think we are already 9 minutes late.
Thank you.
So, Purvita, should we?
See you tomorrow then.
Yeah, see you tomorrow. Purvita, should we continue, or you want to have a small break?
Maybe 1 minute or 2 minutes break, because it's 7:49. So I think some informal discussion can go on for 2 to 3 minutes, then we can start.
Okay, so by that time, Ryan set up his